Well, good evening and welcome to our sex offender community information meeting. My name is Scott Royal. I'm the police chief for the city of Oshkosh. With me out in the hallway is Officer Joe Nichols from the Oshkosh Police Department as well. And the purpose of tonight's meeting is to talk about the sex offender registration program, give you information about the community notification process, give you specific information about the sex offender being released. That's Thomas Peralta Jr., who's being released into the 1700 block of Iowa Street, or has been released there. As well as give you some suggestions for protecting yourself and your family. And with us to give you that information tonight is our panel of experts. So we have Elizabeth Van Abel from, she's a sexual abuse education, a prevention educator from the Reach Counseling Services. Nicole Hall, who's a sex offender registration specialist for the Department of Corrections, and Todd Tim, who is a Department of Corrections field supervisor. Laws exist to protect everyone, including the sex offender, and balance is really the need to protect the public, the need to be sensitive to the victims, the need to inform the community, as well as to enhance the offender's likelihood for successful integration into the community. That takes a community effort, working with law enforcement. Vigilantism is not tolerated. So tonight, we have a relatively small crowd here, but you're going to be getting lots of information, and probably a lot of your questions will be answered by our panel. But during the course of it, we'll be handing out 3x5 cards. So if you have any questions, write your questions down, and we will collect them at the end. Chances are your questions are probably going to be answered. They get into a lot of detail. But if it isn't, we will collect those cards, get those questions to the specific expert, and be happy to answer it as best we can. After the meeting closes, at some point we'll just close the meeting, and sometimes there's an opportunity to meet a little one-on-one with some of the experts afterwards, and maybe they'll be available for that as well. Okay? So to start, I think we'll have Nicole Hall from the Department of Corrections.
Thank you, Chief. As the Chief said, I'm with the Department of Corrections Sex Offender Registry. I cover Winnebago, Fond du Lac, and Calumet counties. I've worked with corrections for 19 years, and the majority of that time has been with the Sex Offender Registry, and then a portion of it was with probation and parole supervising sex offenders. So somewhat accidentally over the years, this has become my area of expertise. And when registrants are released into the community, there's a reaction. Understandably, nobody is pleased to learn that a registered sex offender has moved into their neighborhood. And people have reactions to learning that information. And in order to start a productive conversation about that, I think it's important to take a step back and see what our perceptions are about sex offenders, check them with what we know to be true about sex offenders, and then educate yourselves about the topic in general and about the specific person in question. So just take a moment and think to yourself, when you hear the phrase sex offender, what comes to mind for you? It's different for everybody. A lot of people think about a stranger, or they think about a pedophile, or they think about a child abduction, really truly the very worst of the worst scenarios that occur. Other people have other thoughts, maybe because of an experience that they've had or somebody they know, and maybe they have the realization that most offenders know their victims, and that's what comes to their mind. I like to put up this screen here to further make that point. Looking at this screen, if you had to identify one person on here that you thought was a registered sex offender, you might look around and there's a few that jump out at us like, oh, that person might look like a sex offender, or that person might look like a sex offender. And the reality is they are all currently registered sex offenders in the state of Wisconsin. Two of them are teachers. One of them is were teachers. One of them is a former police officer. One is a former priest. Some people on here have never held a job. Some people had very productive, respectable careers in whatever their field was. And this really illustrates the point that there is no such thing as a typical sex offender. We have a large number of people on our sex offender registry, and I'll get into those numbers in a bit. But when you thought of the phrase sex offender and certain things came to your mind, I wonder if a 13-year-old came to mind, because that is the age of our youngest registrant. I did some checking today, and as of today, our oldest registrant is 98 years old. And we have everything in between. The registry is mostly male offenders, but we definitely do have female offenders. As I mentioned, we have offenders who have never held a job, offenders who have had a variety of different jobs. We have people who have had very notable careers and were well respected in the community. When I was talking about offenders knowing their victims, that is probably one of the biggest misconceptions about the registry. People really tend to think that the registry is comprised of people who choose stranger victims. And that is understandably every parent's, every community, every law enforcement officer's biggest fear is that child stranger abduction. It's a very scary thing. But it is very, very rare. 93% of offenders know their victims. Kids are much more likely to be sexually assaulted by somebody they already know, in their families, in their circle of friends, at the schools they attend, in the clubs that they're a part in. That's where the real risk to kids is. And we'll get into, how do we manage that and what do we do when we know that information. But it really is critical to understand the risk in order to take productive steps to protect kids. Because if people spend all their time looking in the bushes for a stranger, they will miss the true risk to our kids. Likewise, our registry is a spectrum of people who have committed a bunch of different kinds of crimes. And on the more serious end, we do have the stranger offenses, the offenses against very young children, the offenses that involve force and threats. And on the lower end of the spectrum, we have the relationships where victims were underage and unable to consent. It's very rare, though, it happens, but very rarely do we have registrants who are on the registry for a truly cooperative teenage relationship. We're talking the freshman in high school and the senior in high school who were, and I say cooperative and not consenting because there's very good reasons that kids under the age of 16 legally can't consent to sex and shouldn't consent to sex. But the offense where a victim is 14 or 15 and the offender is 18 looks different than the offender that turns 19 or 20 or 23. And our law recognizes that. Actually, there is one way off the registry for adult offenders, and that is those cooperative relationships. That's the only time that the court has discretion about whether somebody registers. But what we see more often at the lower end of the spectrum are the 14 and 15-year-old, typically otherwise kind of neglected kids who don't have good parents, who don't have good homes, with offenders who are 19, 20, 23, and obviously the further apart that gets, the more concerning it gets. So those are the two ends of the spectrum, and we have everything in between. So if you see that somebody is on the sex offender registry, what you know is they've been convicted of a sex offense that requires registration, and that's all we know. And the next step is to find out more about that. And all that is public record. People can gather that information and learn that to protect themselves. I'm glad you're here today. We really feel like an informed community is a safer community. I wish there was more people here today. A room full of people is what I like to see at meetings like this. But you're here, and hopefully you tell people, and people are watching the show to really inform themselves and protect themselves. So although sex offenders are a very individual population, there's a lot of differences in their crimes and the individuals on the registry, there are some commonalities that we see with them. There's some common things. One is that offenders need to have secrecy to offend. They do not announce their intentions. They do not connect with a single mom and say, here, I'd like to help you and be in this relationship with you, and I can help you with the kids, and oh, by the way, I'm probably going to have sexual contact with your 13-year-old son. They don't do that. They need the secrecy to offend. And really, that is the biggest advantage to this registry is the people on this registry don't have that anonymity anymore. It is, you know about this person we're here to talk about tonight. You know about all the other registrants in the city of Oshkosh. You can go look at their picture. You can see where they're living. You can get some preliminary information about what they did. So they've lost their biggest tool to reoffend. Another common thread with sex offenders is that for most sex offenders, the offending is much more about power and control than it is about sex. Likewise with domestic violence isn't somebody just losing their temper. Domestic violence is power and control. It's a very methodical, planned out power play on the victim. That's the same with sexual assault. We do have some of our offenders, a true pedophile, for example, and not all child sex offenders are true pedophiles. But a pedophile is more sexually motivated, along with the power and control, and that does increase their risk to reoffend. But knowing that the power and control is a key component to most offending behaviors will be an important fact to know as we move forward here. So how do 93% of offenders gain access to victims? How are they offending against people they know? And really, it's something that we call grooming. And what grooming really is about is manipulation. And it's an ongoing process of manipulation. And the goal really for the offender is to reduce the chances that the child will resist the abuse. So it's this process of manipulating the child and working on gaining the trust so that when they finally do cross that line and offend against the child, it's unlikely the child will resist. They also want to decrease the chances that the child will report the abuse, and last, that if the child reports it, that they will be believed. And this happens through a lot of different ways, but I already alluded to the trust factor. It really is about gaining the child's trust and the family's trust. And often there's a blurring of the boundaries that might start with tickling or come sit on my lap and kind of breaking down those physical boundaries. They may show the child pornography or expose them to things on the internet to kind of decrease those barriers. Sometimes they use flat-out threats and scare tactics. If you tell, I'm going to do this. But often they don't need that. And that kind of makes sense if you think about the power differential between an adult offender and a child. They really don't need to have the physical threats of force to deter the child from telling or to stop the child from resisting. So it's a pretty awful process to think about, just as awful as it is to think that kids are being assaulted by people that they know and trust. And parents can do all the right things and take all the right efforts, and sometimes bad things can still happen to kids. But if you understand the grooming process, the odds also increase that you can intervene before there's an assault. If you're watching, if you're looking, if you're carefully scrutinizing your children's relationships with other adults, you will likely see something that won't feel right to you. And you can take some steps to interrupt that. And we do really tell people to trust their instincts. We need to teach kids to trust their instincts. We should trust our instincts. And if kids say to us, that person makes me feel uncomfortable. Even, I don't want to kiss Aunt Hazel anymore. I don't know why you make me kiss her. She's old. I don't like it. I don't want to do it. We shouldn't force our kids to do that. You know, you want to maybe give her a high five instead. Maybe Aunt Hazel will be a little offended, but that's okay. It's more important to teach our kids to trust their own instincts. So we have this sex offender registry. That's why we're here tonight, because we have a law that says we can register sex offenders and we can talk to the public about them. And so this law was enacted in 1997 for the state of Wisconsin. There's a variety of laws in all the states. They all came from a federal mandate that I'll get to in a little bit here. But our law took effect June 1st of 1997, and it's actually retroactive to December 25th, 1993. So when this law took effect, we went back and tracked down all people who we had some status over in 93, and we put them on the registry. There's a list of 31 felony sex offenses that require registration. As I said before, it is not discretionary. It's not my decision. It's not the police department's decision. It's not probation and parole. It's usually not even the court's decision. The law says if you're convicted as an adult or adjudicated as a delinquent, so minors, as I said, we have someone 13 years old on our registry. If you're convicted or adjudicated, you must register. In addition, there's other offenses where the court can order registration. So in those cases, if perhaps a burglary appeared really to be sexually motivated and it was interrupted before the sex offense could occur, the court could order that person to register. Most of our registry is required to comply for life. For others, they register for their period of supervision or prison plus 15 additional years. Mr. Peralta, who we're here to talk about tonight, is a lifetime registrant based on what he was convicted of. So registered offenders are required to provide certain information. They're required to verify that information. It's a pretty simple requirement. It is not treatment. It is not supervision. It is a list of registered sex offenders. They have some minimal obligations to report some information to us, and it's a means to track their whereabouts in the community. There are offenders who don't comply with that, and that's part of my job, is to investigate that noncompliance, submit my investigation to the DA's office when appropriate, and request charges. It is a Class H felony not to register in Wisconsin. When I started, it was a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 9 months in jail, but now it's a felony, punishable by up to 6 years in prison. I'm here to say that in Winnebago County, I'm having very good outcomes on the cases that I refer to them, and in general, they're taken very seriously. Furthermore, when we look back to the intent behind this registry law that we have, it's important to know that the goal was for there to be this balance, and Chief Groyle alluded to this. There's a balance between community's protection, the community's right to know about sex offenders, and the offender's successful reintegration. Now, often when I say that last part, I get a reaction of, well, we don't care about the offender, they don't care about kids, they hurt people, we don't care about their rights. And for me, it's less about the offender's rights than it is about no more victims. So I define successful reintegration as somebody who is not reoffending, who is not creating more victims. And the reality is, sex offenders have always been in our communities. They always have been, and they always will be. Mr. Peralta was released because by statute he had reached the point of his criminal sentence where he needed to be released on parole. Nobody in this room made a decision to release him. The police department did not make a decision to release him. It was the way the laws were written at the time he was sentenced. And so, and most sex offenders don't go to prison. And when they do, eventually, like Mr. Peralta, they come out. So if you accept that sex offenders are going to be in our communities, unless the courts make a sentence that keeps the person in for their life, they will come back out. Then how do we create an environment that decreases the chance that they will reoffend? Now, ultimately, whose job is it not to reoffend? It's the offenders. And I've spent my whole career holding offenders accountable, and I think we need to do that, and we do that. But I'm also trying to be realistic about what kind of a scenario makes it more likely that they will be successful. And if you accept what the research says and what the experts say, that sex offenses are more about power and control than anything, what happens when offenders come out and no one will rent to them and no one will hire them, and they're being harassed, or their family's being harassed, or their home is being vandalized, to their sense of power and control over their own life and their own chances to succeed. Again, it's their job not to reoffend no matter what, but we want to make it an environment where they're likely to not create more victims. We don't do community notification on every single sex offender. We don't. We really highlight the ones that we want people to pay attention to. We have had communities who put every single offender in the paper. And what we found is people stopped paying attention to anybody. We do quite a few notifications in Oshkosh. We've had many of these meetings, and you can see the attendance here, and sometimes we have even less attendance than that. So when we want to have this balance where when we want you to pay attention to somebody, we can get people's attention and have you listen about this particular offender. Another goal with this law was to take away the secrecy that offenders have had, which I think this law has done a good job of doing. And last, it is a tool for law enforcement, for the community, and for victims. So for law enforcement, really the whole reason we have a registry is because of one of those very rare but very awful cases. Jacob Wetterling, you might remember Jacob in 1989. He lived in Minnesota, and he was with his brother and his cousin. They were all 10, 11 years old, and a masked man pulled up and took Jacob and sent the other two boys running into the woods, and Jacob has never been seen since. So law enforcement in that community, the citizens of that community, his parents, and I had the very fortunate opportunity to meet his mother recently at a conference I was at. They said, we had not much to go on, but the eyewitness accounts of two very scared little boys, but we had a vehicle description. We had some information, at least a list of the convicted sex offenders in the area would have given us a place to start. And that's how this got going. And what we're working on in the very early stages in this county is a response team to child abductions. And the sex offender registry is going to be a critical component to that. If there is one of those worst case scenarios that happens here, we want our registry to be accurate so it can be the tool for law enforcement that it was intended to be. Victims monitor the people who offended against them. They keep track of where they are and they watch, and it gives them some peace of mind to know where this person is living, where this person is working. They monitor that. Another reason we want our registry to be accurate. And last, it's for the general public. So you can make a decision about your neighbor if you want to have him over for a bonfire, or you want to send your child to so-and-so's house for piano lessons. So there's a lot of value in this registry and that we keep it accurate. There are over 23,100 registered sex offenders in the state of Wisconsin. That's a large number. Let me break it down for you a little bit. Of that number, about 5,800 are incarcerated right now. So we're not as concerned about them at the time for the time being, but they are still listed in that 23,000 number. Then there are 5,453 that are on active probation and parole supervision. You have the advantage that Mr. Peralta is on active probation and parole supervision. Sometimes we do these meetings. I did one in January in this county where that person had no supervision whatsoever. He had the registry, he had a few other laws, but there were not rules about what he could or couldn't do outside of that. When there is supervision, there's a lot more resources that we have to hold this person accountable and prevent any new victims. And that's what Todd Tim is going to talk about a little bit more. But the number I really want you to pay attention to is 11,850 of our registered sex offenders are off of probation and parole supervision. They have served the sentence imposed on them by the court. If the court said 10 years, they did their 10 years and they are done. Those people, they're otherwise free citizens and they move about in our communities. And they live where they live because we live where we live. They can afford it. It's close to their work. It's where they grew up. It's the house that they own. It's whatever their reason is, that's where they are. There's been a lot of discussion about where offenders are placed in our community, in the city of Oshkosh, where they live. For almost 12,000 of our offenders, we are not approving their residence. They are moving about and they choose to live where they live. So it's a small percentage of our registry where we actually either place them, for example, in a halfway house or at one of our transitional living places, or approve a residence that they've proposed to us. Breaking the number down a little bit, every county in the state has registered sex offenders. This number is a little bit old, but it doesn't vary too much. Winnebago County in January had 435 registered sex offenders. Does that mean that there's 435 sex offenders in Winnebago County? No. It means that there's 435 registered sex offenders. And that brings me back to one other point I wanted to make about this. The 23,100, although that's a large number and it seems like really bad news, the good news about that is we know about those people. They've lost their anonymity. They've lost their biggest tool for offending. What concerns me, after working with this population for so long, are the ones we don't know about. Still, 80 to 90% of sexual assaults don't get reported to the police. 1 out of 4 girls by the time they're 18, and 1 out of 6 boys will be sexually abused. So if you've done something different for your safety because Mr. Peralta's in your neighborhood, and Mr. Peralta, let's say he moves in a year, should you let your guard down and stop doing whatever it was that you were doing? Absolutely not. Because just because Mr. Peralta isn't there doesn't mean that there's not somebody there that we haven't identified yet. Doesn't mean that there's not a registered sex offender there who doesn't meet the criteria for notification. Is that fair? No. But is that our reality? It really is. Our child's safety is our responsibility. Our safety is our responsibility, and we have to know the facts so we can take productive steps. Every county at some point feels like they're getting a disproportionate share of sex offenders. I've worked in small counties, I've worked in large counties, and I think I saw a posting on the Oshkosh Police Department's Facebook page where someone said, well, why are they all in Oshkosh? And someone said, well, you should come to Fond du Lac. They're all in Fond du Lac. And that really highlights my experience in working with different counties. And sometimes police departments who are proactive, like your police department, in sharing the information with you, I think the community has a misperception that means that there's more sex offenders, where perhaps, I mean, there are more in the sense that there's more people in this community than in the rural areas, but they're notifying you. They're giving you the information. You're seeing that information in the media. You're getting the flyer in your door. And that really is to give you information so you can be safer. These are some screenshots involving maps. So if you look here, this is Winnebago County. The upper part is Winneconne, the lower part is Omro, and the blue and the red and the green dots reflect where the sex offenders live, registered sex offenders. The next screenshot is Oshkosh. There's obviously more. And the next screenshot is Milwaukee. So the larger the county, the more people, the more registered sex offenders, as we saw here. Milwaukee County has much more sex offenders, registered sex offenders, than Winnebago. And the larger the city within the county, the more offenders. And typically the downtown area that is closest to transportation, where there's more affordable housing, is where the almost 12,000 registered sex offenders choose to be, and where often probation and parole has to approve a residence out of the options that they have available to them. What does it mean when somebody has to register? Well, they have to tell us some basic things: where they live, where they work or volunteer, where they go to school, and their internet identifiers. When they're on supervision, probation and parole makes a judgment about whether or not they can have internet access and what that might look like. When they're off supervision, there are not restrictions other than they must tell us that they have a Facebook page or they have an email account. In addition, we mail offenders letters that essentially are registration forms they have to fill out and get back to us within 10 days to verify their information. So failure to do either one of those things is a violation. It places them in noncompliance. We investigate it, and when appropriate, we refer for felony charges for failure to register. So that's the registration piece of our law. How do we determine notification? How is it decided to come knock on your doors and let you know about Mr. Peralta? Well, our law says that DOC registers people, the Department of Corrections, and law enforcement makes decisions about notification. That's where it makes the distinction. So in this case, when Mr. Peralta came out of prison a year ago and moved into a downtown residence in the city of Oshkosh, per statute, we as the department mailed the police department and the county sheriff's department a notice called a special bulletin notice. By law, we have to do that because he was coming out of prison and he had 2 or more convictions. That's the criteria for this special bulletin notice. And what that notice does is it triggers law enforcement to say, we're going to take a look at this person to determine if they meet the criteria for notification. There are almost 200 registrants in the city of Oshkosh. They move about. Notification does not occur on every registrant for every move. Typically, it's one of these special bulletin notices that we want to highlight and we want people to be aware of. So that notice was issued last year, and we did a notification meeting just like this almost a year ago in this very same room. So now a year has come, he's found a different residence that was approved by probation and parole. And so law enforcement, we did not need to send another notice. Law enforcement did not need to do another notification. But we are proactive with these. So probation and parole informed the police department. The police department was proactive and did the flyers and the press releases. And when it appeared that there was some community interest, we did this community notification meeting. That's your police department being proactive. Law enforcement can notify on any registrant, though, even if they don't meet this special bulletin notice criteria. I find that the police departments I work with, including the Oshkosh Police Department, use that pretty appropriately. If there's we had one registrant who had a kiddie pool in his backyard. He was off of supervision. The neighborhood kids were coming and swimming. He had no kids of his own. And so we investigated some other things, but one of the things that the police department did was sent flyers out to every house in that neighborhood to say, this person's a registered sex offender. He was not a special bulletin notice offender, but we want you to be aware, and it's probably not a good idea to send your kids swimming in his backyard. So those are the types of scenarios where I see this being used. In addition, notification occurs 24/7 on our website. That really is the truth for the registry information. It's where people should go to find the information. If you don't have a computer or you're not computer literate, find a 13-year-old and have them show you how to do it. And you can probably educate them in the process. In it, you can enroll. We partner with FamilyWatchdog.com, which is not the official registry, but we give them our information and they share their maps with us. You can enroll with Family Watchdog to get an email alert when a new registrant moves into a radius around your house. So there are tools out there people can use to inform themselves about the other offenders where there's not active notification occurring. In addition to the registry and probation and parole for some of our offenders, there are some other laws that apply to offenders, even when they're done with probation and parole. Those are as follows. Registered sex offenders cannot change their name or provide an alias. It's a felony if they do. They cannot photograph, film, or videotape minors other than their own children without written permission of the parent. And now, this is a brand new law. It was passed in December. Registered sex offenders must inform a school of their status on the registry and their intentions to be on school grounds prior to being on school grounds. There are certain child sex offenders that are, by law, not allowed to work or volunteer with kids. And then there's two other laws that apply to this population. One is that certain offenders need to be on lifetime GPS. Mr. Peralta meets that criteria. He will be on lifetime GPS monitoring even when he's completed his probation and parole supervision. Also, offenders coming out of prison are reviewed to see if they should be civilly committed for treatment as a sexual predator. All offenders are reviewed to see what risk they pose and if they meet that criteria. Some communities have said, we want to do everything we can to protect our children, so we think we're going to pass one of those ordinances that say that sex offenders can't live within 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet of a school or a park or a daycare center. And I understand the logic behind that. It seems to make sense that if you keep the sex offenders away from the kids at the schools and the parks, that there will be less offending. And every community has to decide for themselves, and there's talk sometimes about other legislative ways to manage this population, but what we've learned about these, I think people need to be aware of before they make those decisions, because we found out that in the areas that have them, there are a lot of unintended negative consequences that people really aren't aware of. So in Iowa, they passed a state law that said sex offenders can't live 2,000 feet from school, park, daycare center, which excluded a lot of the state of Iowa for where offenders could live. And what they found is that their noncompliance with the sex offender registry almost doubled. So people were either not registering or providing false information. So again, if you remember why we have a registry, because of Jacob Wetterling and the abduction, and that we want this as a tool for law enforcement, then they lose the ability to have an accurate registry. And more importantly, in my mind, is they found no reduction in their sex crimes, which is really the motive behind these restrictions, right, is to lessen the offending, and it doesn't do that. Florida is like Wisconsin, where it goes jurisdiction by jurisdiction by jurisdiction. The rules are different everywhere. It varies. And so there was a task force, a multi-jurisdictional task force, and they found an increase in homelessness, transience, and clustering of sex offenders. They genuinely are all living under the bridge. I shouldn't say all. They are living in pockets in certain places, like under bridges. Now, not because I'm feeling bad for the sex offender, but a homeless, unstable sex offender in that kind of situation concerns me much more for their risk to reoffend than someone with a stable residence, and we can identify that that's where they are. That study also found that housing instability is a consistent and robust predictor of absconding from supervision, probation violations, and reoffending. California has a state law. 1/3 of the people on parole in California for sex offenses are reporting that they're homeless. And that is 3 times higher than before the restrictions were enacted. And I've had an experience with one of our offenders who lives there, reports he's homeless. Is he really homeless? I don't know. Is he living in a restricted area and just not telling? I mean, it becomes a very difficult thing to enforce. And then there's a brand new study, hot off the presses, I just got it this week, of the Michigan and Missouri's restrictions. And they found no significant impact on recidivism. It was a little bit higher in one state, a little bit lower in another state, but their sexual recidivism was 3%. Most people think that sex offenders all reoffend. And actually the numbers are much lower than people might think that they are. This isn't the first study I've seen where the numbers are 3%, 5%, some are 10%, 15%. Now, any percent is unacceptable. And the real number is higher than that, right, because not everybody gets caught. But it is still lower than what I think most people assume it is. And again, what they found was no decline in the registrants actually living in the restricted area. It was a 1% decline. It was not significant. Not just Nicole Hall telling you that these are not effective. There's prosecuting attorneys in Iowa that say they're not effective. In general, many law enforcement agencies have concerns about them. The researchers of those studies I was talking to you about, they had some concerns about them. The Jacob Wetterling Foundation, I think you recall that I talked to you about that case. His mother says that these are misguided pieces of legislation and that she feels that there's much more value in knowing where people are and having an accurate registry. And victim advocacy groups. So groups whose job is to advocate for victims, nationally, statewide, and even locally, have found that these restrictions aren't doing what they're intended to do. And that's because they're based on the stranger danger myth. Again, most offenders know their victims. There is no statistical decline in reoffending. They still remain in the area. Even if they really move, they're coming back to visit. Before Mr. Peralta was approved to live here, he may have been visiting his girlfriend or fiance's parents there. So offenders are still in the area, even if they're not living there, sleeping there at night. And it increases things we know lead to sexual reoffense. So every community has to decide what's best for them, but we really do find that when we add another layer of barrier in finding where this population can live, it tends to do more harm than good, and we lose the benefit of the other things we have in place to manage this population. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd Tim to discuss Mr. Peralta's case and the supervision plan.
Good evening. My name is Todd Tim. I'm a supervisor with the State Department of Corrections Probation and Parole Office in Oshkosh. I've been with Corrections. I'm in my 28th year now. And what I'd like to do is talk to you about a couple of things regarding Mr. Peralta, as well as some of the strategies that we, as probation and parole, will do to help keep the community safe. Mr. Peralta was released, as Nicole had said, last February. He had been living in downtown Oshkosh for the past year. During the past month, Mr. Peralta proposed a new residence, which is the residence on 1700 block of Iowa. Our agents went out, did an assessment of the area, looked at the entire situation as far as appropriateness. Is it a valid plan? All the scenarios or all the situations that go into us doing an assessment. We made the decision at that point to go forward with the initial approval. At that point, then we went to and initiated our core team, which includes law enforcement, DA's office, and other individuals that get together and we discuss our highest level sex offenders in the community that are under registration and special bulletin notifications. At that point, we made the decisions to go out and notify the community. The residence was essentially approved at that point. We did not place him there. He brought that residence to us, and we gave approval on that. Hence our reason for being here tonight. Mr. Peralta, his history goes back to 1999. Actually, it was even before that, but the offenses that we're here for tonight occurred tonight. He was convicted in 1999 of 5 different counts, including first-degree sexual assault of a child, as well as other related offenses, including possession of child pornography, allowing individuals under the age of 13 to view sexual acts, as well as other offenses. He was originally sentenced to a total of 17 years in prison. He served his initial incarceration until August of 2008, where he was paroled to supervision. He came to Oshkosh. For 2 years, he was on parole in our community here. At that point in 2010, he violated his supervision. He violated rules. He did not commit a new crime. He violated rules by violating no contact provisions. He was terminated from programming that he was involved in, as well as he was found to have been using a computer outside of his work functions. So at that point, the decision was made to revoke his supervision, and he was sent back to prison. for a certain period of time. And as Nicole said, in February 2013, he reached his mandatory release from prison, and he was now released back into our community. Some of the things that we have been doing and we will do with Mr. Peralta is in our office, we have 19 probation and parole agents that supervise well over 1,000 individuals in the Oshkosh and general Winnebago County area. There's actually 32 agents in Winnebago County, including the Neenah Menasha office. We have 4 agents in our office that specialize in the higher risk sex offender supervision. They have lower caseloads. The average probation and parole agent has anywhere from 75 to 90 clients on their caseload. What we've done is we've taken these 4 agents and we've given them specialized caseload and specialized training in supervising sex offenders. They have approximately 20 to 25 offenders on their caseload. All sex offenders, all of them registrants, some of them SBNs, like Mr. Peralta is. What that does with the lower caseload, it gives them an opportunity to spend more time with the individual, do more monitoring, make sure they're involved in any appropriate programming that's deemed necessary, whatever that programming may be, and that they're following the rules. One of the advantages with offenders such as Mr. Peralta that we have as a tool is the global positioning, the GPS bracelet that he is required to be on for the rest of his life. When he's on parole supervision, up until 2018 when he discharges completely from parole and then will only be on the registry, we can include areas that he can't go. We've done that already. There's been areas around parks and schools and victims, or there's a whole variety of things we call exclusion zones. So if this individual is going through town and he stops by a park and sits in a park, the GPS system will send an alert to him to say, you're in an unauthorized zone, leave immediately. If that person does not leave immediately, it sends a signal to our 24-hour monitoring center. Monitoring center then will notify the local police department, and that person will be placed in custody. A warrant will be issued for them immediately, and they'll be placed in custody. Sometimes it's inadvertent, sometimes it's on purpose where those particular zones are, and it's specific to the individual. A vast majority of offenders that are on the GPS system have problems with that, and we deal with that, like I said, swiftly. It's not always a major violation, but it's a violation in itself, and we have to deal with that. And that's one of the tools, the advantages of having that tool, the lifetime GPS system. One of the other things we do with these type of sex offenders that are on their highest level of supervision with the agent, they have to report in face-to-face contact with the agent once a week at a minimum. They also have to do at least once a month home visit, face-to-face home visit in their location. One, to verify they're living there, and to also the agent can get into the home and make sure everything appears to be on board as far as their living arrangements, that they're living with who they're supposed to be living with, and they're in compliance with their supervision. Sex offenders have an additional set of rules on top of the rules that all offenders are on probation and parole. There's certain rules that everyone has to follow, that every offender, no matter if you write a bad check, you rob a bank, or you're a sex offender, has rules to follow. They're standard rules of supervision, and they're all basically common sense rules, but they're ones that they're required to follow. Sex offenders have specific rules related to their offense. They may have to do with no contact with children, which Mr. Peralta has. He has a no contact rule with children. Many sex offenders have no alcohol and drugs, no going into bars, no leaving the area without letting their agent know. So there's a whole variety of specific individualized rules for sex offenders, and Mr. Peralta is no different than any of the other ones where he has a whole specific set of rules. If you have questions what some of those specific rules are, feel free to call my office and talk to the agent or myself, and we will let you know specific rules that he does have as far as what he can and cannot do while he's on supervision. Some of the other tools that we have, we use polygraphs. Most of our SBNs and many of our sex offender registrants have to go through regular polygraph examinations to see how they've been doing on supervision and to see if they've been truthful with their agent regarding some of their triggers for reoffending or how they've been doing on supervision if they're following the rules. So they have to go through polygraphs regularly. Regularly, usually twice a year they go through them. We can ask them to do more often if we have reason to believe there's something we need to try to get to the bottom of. And again, polygraphs are a tool that we use to try to help with our supervision of our offenders. Bottom line is, we can't be there 24 hours a day. Even with a reduced caseload, agents work 40 hours a week. That leaves a lot of other hours during the week, in the evenings, on the weekends, where we rely on our tools as well as we rely on our community. One of the reasons we do this meeting as well is to try to empower you as the individuals in our community. If you see something, and Nicole says, and she always mentions that, if something just doesn't feel right, give us a call. Let us know. Let us try to investigate, see what's going on with this. It may be nothing or it may be something serious. But if you see something in the neighborhood that just doesn't feel right, please, by all means, give our office a call during the week. Give the police department a call during non-traditional work hours. We have to work as a community, and that's all of us as partners to make this work and to try to keep him and others from reoffending in our community. So it's very important to utilize our citizens of our community, and that's one of the advantages of having these type of meetings, is to try to empower everyone. I think that's about all I have specifically regarding Mr. Peralta and the fact how we run our supervision. As I said, he will be on parole supervision until 2018 with us. After that, he will be required to stay on the registry for the rest of his life, as well as the GPS system. So with that, thank you.
Good evening. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm from Reach Counseling Services. We're a licensed mental health agency. We have an office in Neenah and an office in Oshkosh. My role at Reach Counseling is I'm a educator. I go into the schools and create an awareness for the kids on what sexual abuse is, and we teach them the protective behaviors. In all of our elementary schools, in all of our middle schools and high schools, Reach is in there. In most years, in the middle schools, in the elementary, in the 7th grade, the high school, and then if I'm not in there, we've got counselors that are going in there, and what we do is we teach them protective behaviors. Protective behaviors gives the children the permission to say no to uncomfortable touch, confusing touch, anything that makes them feel uncomfortable. And so when Nicole was talking about those early warning signs, we teach them to pay attention to how their body feels. And if they're feeling, getting any of those early warning signs, they're not feeling safe, they don't feel like they have choice, they don't feel like they have control, they don't know if that situation is going to end, we teach them to go talk to a trusted adult. To give you an example of that, we had a young boy that made a connection. He realized that every time mom's new boyfriend came around, he would get those early warning signs. The new boyfriend had never touched him, had never said anything to him, but he told me he just felt creeped out, that he just had these goosebumps. So he went home, talked to his mom and said, I get my early warning signs when that new boyfriend of yours comes around. Mom went into FamilyWatchdog.USA and realized that her new boyfriend was not even supposed to be around kids. He had been convicted of this. So one of the things you want to teach children is pay attention to those physical feelings because they give us information. The other thing that we teach them is they can say no. To any grown-up, to any person, you can say no. To stand up, be assertive, and then walk away, get away, and go talk to one of the trusted adults in their life. And just say, I don't know why, but I'm not feeling comfortable. The other thing to protect children is teach them a code. When they're not with you, that's when we are, protective. We're like, are they safe? Well, teach them a code. If for any reason they're not feeling comfortable, they should be able to call you or call one of those people on the trusted network and say, for instance, with my kids, this was our code. Mom, what time is soccer practice? They could call. And then I would know that they were not feeling safe. And then I would say, okay, tell your friend, Mom's coming picking you up. And then I would pick them up and we would talk about it. So do you have a code with your children, your grandchildren, if they're not feeling safe? The other thing that we teach is about secrets, that there are some secrets that we can't keep. Because we know that 93% of the time when someone does sexually abuse a child, it involves secrets, it involves that person is known to that child, and they threaten them, force them, let them think that they're going to get in trouble, and then tell them that they can't tell anyone. Nobody's going to believe them. So one of the things you can talk about is secrets. You know, bad secrets make us feel bad. And do you have one of those? When your child comes back from a sleepover, or when they're visiting someone, ask the question, how did that go? Do you want to go back to Grandpa's? Do you want to go back to that place? How was the babysitter? When your child is, maybe you have a babysitter, pop in. See how things are going. Oh, I forgot my checkbook. And just let the babysitter or whoever that trusted adult is know that you're going to be stopping in. But teach your kids that they can say no, even to grown-ups, if something feels uncomfortable and they're not safe. And then get together and talk about that. So we talk about that they're powerful, that we're just creating awareness of what that is, and that if they have a voice, and that if they're not feeling comfortable, if they have questions, please ask us, that there's no question that would be uncomfortable. But we can't always be everywhere with our children, but when we can get back together, we let them know that they're important, and that if there's any secrets, if there's anything that they want to talk to us, that's what we're there about. And then make sure you have those safety rules. Say no, get away, talk to a trusted adult, and then help them to understand what those body feelings are when they're not safe, to pay attention to those.
I have a question about how somebody can find out where a sex offender is employed. So if an offender is on supervision and you have questions about their employment and if it's appropriate, you can contact the probation and parole office and ask them about that person's supervision and kind of what their status is. When somebody is off supervision and they're just listed on the registry, we don't put that information on the website at this point. But if there's a specific concern or a specific question, if you called us, we could talk with you about that and maybe work with law enforcement to see if that's an appropriate part of notification or something that would be beneficial for you or the community to know.
I have a couple of questions that came that I hope I can answer. One is, if he cannot have contact with children, what happens if his fiancée gets pregnant, and are they allowed to have children? The contact with children is a general no contact. If there's a specific thing with a family function and we approve a chaperone to be there, type of scenario, we may allow him to have a contact, not alone, but with children in a general sense if there's approved chaperones there to keep an eye on things. Answer to the specific question, we have no control whether someone has children or not. If they choose to have children, that's up to them. We would look at each individual scenario or each individual case specific to whether that person could have contact with children. If their offense was offending against infant children, chances are we may not allow that individual to live in the same household if they had additional children in the future. But that's on a case-by-case basis, so I can't give you a 100% answer on that question, but we would definitely take a look at that scenario if it did come forward to us. The other question was specific about attractions and treatment issues. I can't really get into specifics regarding Mr. Peralta because of laws that prohibit me from talking about specific treatment issues. But most sex offenders have things that have triggered their offending in their past. One of the things they work on in general in treatment is recognizing what those triggers are and doing things to prevent those things from going forward. Those feelings may always be there, but one of the things we hope they learn in treatment is how to control that, how to talk to others, how to do other things, which could be anything from calling an individual to meditation, to going into treatment, to sometimes going to jail for the night or for a weekend. If they're on probation supervision, if they come to their agent and say, I'm having feelings that I may be reoffending, well, we may put them in custody to protect the community, protect them from reoffending until we can get a handle on what's going on with that individual.
So in each of those scenarios, if an individual, those feelings don't go away just because they've been in prison for 6 or 8 or 10 or 20 years. But hopefully they can be controlled through specific treatment programs, specific counseling that they go through throughout the rest of their life. I know it's not a comparison to an alcoholic, but in some ways it is. Once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. You have to control the triggers that get an alcoholic to start drinking again. It's on a much grander scale, a much more serious scale with sex offenders, but it's the same type of scenario. They have to understand why they reoffended, and that's what treatment's all about. Understand why they reoffend and how they can prevent it in the future.